Ooh, this one's tough. I'm gonna say yay. Oh no, why don't you take it away, Tiana?
Welcome to On Deadline, the Washington Examiner's political game show. I'm Tiana Lowe Doescher, the economics columnist, and I'm here with Christian Datoc, our White House correspondent. Today we start above the fold, where each of us have 1 minute to discuss the most important news story of the week. Christian, what are you looking at?
Over the past week, we've had two separate garbage-related incidents that could threaten to really upend the entire election. First, at Trump's rally at MSG, comedian Tony Hinchcliffe warmed up the crowd by calling Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage.
I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Just a few days later, Joe Biden made a similar slip-up.
The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
But he handed Republicans a deplorables 2.0 moment in the interim. Both of these mistakes could have been easily avoided. Somebody at the Trump team could have said, hey, maybe a roast comedian is going to go up on stage and say something super inflammatory. On the other hand, Joe Biden has been sequestered to the basement ever since Harris took over the top of the ticket. Why is the campaign now unleashing him to try and woo Hispanic voters of all people? Candidates matter, let's be honest, but staffers are equally as important. And I'd be concerned about any administration who has its staff making these type of unforced errors this late in the game.
And it's not quite fair to, Trump and Harris both want to deflect, right? Harris wants to pretend I'm not responsible for what Joe Biden says. Trump wants to say I'm not responsible. But we both know that the buck does stop with leadership, right? Trump has the final say over the guest list. He should be telling people, screen the questions and screen the jokes before it goes into the teleprompter. And lest we all forget, Joe Biden still is the sitting president of the United States.
Tiana, what's on your mind this week?
For all that the press obsesses over Donald Trump, the reason why he's heading into Election Day, the favorite, albeit on a very thin margin, is because this has become a referendum on the incumbent administration. And it's not necessarily Kamala Harris's sole fault. Joe Biden decided that he had the mandate to fulfill all the liberal goals since the post-Great Recession era. He had zero interest rates and spent like a drunken soldier. He decided to abdicate America's global leadership in favor of a multipolar world, and he decided to see if he could balance open borders with an ever-expanding welfare state. And that experiment, it has failed. It's why he's one of the most unpopular presidents in post-war history, and it's why Kamala Harris faces an uphill battle. The fact is, Americans want more meritocracy, not critical theory. We want security, not laxity. And that's why America First is beating America Last.
You know, Tiana, I think we've talked about this before, both on the show and elsewhere. The economy is really the only thing that's running this election in my mind. Of course, you have people who are opposed to Donald Trump, and you have diehard Democrats who want to see the first female president. But what I'm worried about is if Donald Trump wins the election, he puts this new tariff policy in place, we see some of these positive economic indicators that have popped up go totally out the window. Where does the country go from there? Because I'm not so sure we can handle another economic crisis 4 years after getting out of COVID. That seems to me like it's a recipe for disaster, but we're just gonna have to wait and see what happens. Up next, Yays and Nays, a segment where we both get to vote on this week's trending topics.
Is the Julia Roberts ad about secret voting too heavy-handed?
Did you make the right choice?
Sure did, honey.
I'm voting no on this one. I knew you were gonna vote yes. Why don't you take the lead?
Quite frankly, the argument that they're trying to make that if you are married to a Trump supporter, you should feel the need that you have to keep your vote secret in order to vote for Kamala Harris, the insinuation is insulting. That is, by definition, if you're scared of telling your spouse who you're voting for, that's an abusive relationship. And it doesn't matter if your husband's a Trump supporter or a Harris supporter, you should be allowed to have your vote. But it's fomenting this idea that women don't have the strength to stick up for themselves to their husbands and they should accept that sort of behavior as normal. And I think it's the exact opposite of what it was trying to do.
You know, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I don't think this ad is too heavy-handed because it's completely ineffectual. Let's be honest. This was a bizarre take. Julia Roberts being the big-name celebrity globbed on. Of course, it gets media coverage. But if you actually watch the spot, they don't talk about policies at all. The supposed Republican man is wearing all blue. The woman who might be voting Republican is wearing, blue and an American flag hat. It doesn't make sense. I was a little confused. I had to watch it back a couple of times, And when it comes down to it, this late in the race, I can't expect this is actually going to change anyone's opinion when early voting has already been ongoing for over a week.
This is the last election cycle Republicans agree to mainstream media debates.
Definitely not. We're going to be seeing mainstream debates as long as we have presidential elections. And as bad as Donald Trump's debate against Kamala Harris was, you just have to look to the VP debate to see how this could go well for Republicans. I mean, we assumed the moderators would take a similar tact to that first debate with Trump and Harris. But what we saw instead was Tim Walz seeming like he had never debated before, even though he's been in government for 20 years. Even though he was a high school teacher, he seemed flustered by simple questions and was unable to answer or defend his policy positions. For that reason alone, Republicans are going to want to lean into debating, especially when you have someone more, diligent and a traditional politician than Donald Trump is.
Yeah, and one of the biggest myths, to at least those of us in the press, we know it's a myth, is the idea that Donald Trump doesn't love the mainstream media. There's a reason why he's always calling the New York Times to leak. And right now, Republicans thrive with having an openly hostile, an openly adversarial and biased press to compete against. And that's why J.D. Vance's performance was so impressive in that debate.
The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check. And since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on.
So why would they give that up when the media is literally the most unpopular profession and industry polled by Gallup, except for Congress?
We will have one final October surprise before the election.
Ooh, this one's tough. I'm going to say yay. Oh, no. Why don't you take it away, Tiana?
Haven't we already had all the surprises? And as you pointed out, this is the main reason why I wonder whether we'll have any October surprise that we perceive as a surprise rather than just the fact that we've been so dulled to chaos and craziness and assassination attempts. It's also the fact that the majority of North Carolina has already voted. Potentially, the majority of Nevada's already voted. So when you have all the crucial states, what surprise is going to make a difference in a swing state or places that haven't already returned in the majority of their ballots, like California, where they already know how they're voting anyway?
Most of the voting has already happened. That's true in some of these swing states. But that doesn't mean a surprise isn't going to happen. I'm just basing this purely off of what I've seen in politics over the last 10 years. I'm never surprised by anything because we live in a time of unexpected political surges. And we have 5 days before the election. Again, I think anything could happen at this point in time. I won't be surprised by anything. That's why I voted yes.
With first Peter Navarro and now Steve Bannon released from prison, will Trump consider getting the gang back together?
100%, without a doubt, absolutely, in my mind. I've seen enough mafia movies to know that once you go to jail, you come back welcomed as a hero.
Never rat on your friends, and always keep your mouth shut.
Hey, here he is.
Oh, you broke your cherry.
And that's kind of how the Trump political family is run. Donald Trump prioritizes loyalty among any trait that a political staffer could have, be they at an entry level or a senior advisor level like Steve Bannon was during the first Trump administration. Let's not forget, Steve Bannon essentially created Donald Trump and his modern political persona. I would expect, should Trump win the election, both of those men to be involved heavily in his second administration.
We'll see what Trump really intends with his tariff policy based, I was thinking specifically about Peter Navarro, because the ongoing debate is whether or not Trump is using these tariffs with the intention as a diplomatic tool, right, to get people, to get Mexico to crack down on illegal immigration, to get NATO countries to pay more of their fair share for defense spending, or is this a serious ideological conviction where he really wants to blow up bilateral trade agreements in favor of this universal tariff? We'll see, and that will really depend on Navarro's proximity to the inner circle. Now it's time for us to fill in the blank.
Harris's decision to give a speech at the same site as Trump's Stop the Steal rally is blank.
I think this was calculated, and I didn't expect Kamala Harris's speech to be some brand new overture she hasn't been making for the last 3 months. Trump bad, economic policies are going to be okay, let's finish the fight, joy, right? We heard that.
It is a choice about whether we have a country rooted in freedom for every American, or ruled by chaos and division.
But what it did do was draw 75,000 people, give or take a few, down to the ellipse, the site of the January 6th rally Donald Trump had, and it's going to get him talking about crowd sizes, and that's going to bring the conversation back to January 6th. It's what the Harris campaign wants to focus on these final few days. I don't know if it will work.
I'd say it's bonkers, quite simply because of the optics. In an interview right before that speech, she said, "I wanted to have the White House behind me because that's where I'll get the work done." As though the sitting vice president of the United States doesn't already have an office within the West Wing, right? She's been there for 4 years, and what has she succeeded in doing? Bringing 10 million illegal aliens into the country, wars in Ukraine and Gaza, real wages, and real disposable income, both down 4% since the start of her rule in that same White House.
It is blank that early voter turnout is this high this election cycle.
It's probably good for Republicans. Republicans have exchanged usually, those suburban women that voted for Bush, the security moms, they backed Romney. They turned away, and in response, Trump has solidified these low propensity voters. And we've seen it really hurt Republicans in midterm elections because these lower propensity voters, they don't come out just to vote for senators. But if he gets a lot of these first-time voters, it will not only carry Donald Trump to the presidency, but it will give him a, potentially 3 or 4 seat majority in the Senate. And that means he can actually get stuff done.
My word for this is narrative defying, because while I do agree the early voting numbers generally are a good sign for Republicans, it repudiates basically everything we've heard about the Republican Party when it comes to early voting for the last 4 years. Again, we heard from Donald Trump, the expanded early voting opened up the window to voter fraud. 2021, a number of states enact legislation that tamps down on that, but that hasn't stopped the chorus. And I do think results matter. And if Republicans see that early voting helps them win an election, a particularly close election, they're going to abandon all of this nonsense about early voting equals voter fraud. It couldn't come soon enough, to be quite frank.
The Joe Rogan experience will blank the election.
I think the Joe Rogan experience will have no impact on the election at all, and I'll tell you why. Yes, Joe Rogan has one of the biggest podcasts in America. Yes, both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance did interviews with him during the final weeks of the campaign. But let's be honest, if you're a religious Joe Rogan viewer or listener or however you consume his media, are you really open to voting to Kamala Harris? I mean, Joe Rogan, even though he himself is not specifically political, is basically one of the big 3 or big 4 Mount Rushmore figures in the young male conservative movement right now. I don't think Donald Trump doing the interview while Harris didn't do the interview is going to substantively sway voting demographics.
I think you're right about the influence, which is why I'm going to say it will come to symbolize the election. If Donald Trump loses, it will symbolize part of the reason why. The doubling down in the manosphere, the idea of, the guys versus gal election, which, to be clear, Kamala Harris has also doubled down on her side. If he wins, it proves the success of his transition from the GOP away from a white, college-educated, higher-income party into, a more working-class, multiracial coalition, aka the base of Joe Rogan viewers.
Up next, it's Quick Quips, our lightning closeout round. Now, Tiana, there is a prophecy on the internet that says sports could determine the outcome of this election. Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl in 2020. The Los Angeles Dodgers won the World Series in 2020. The Dodgers won the World Series this week. The Super Bowl doesn't happen until February, but do you think the Chiefs and a Democrat will win this time around again?
I want nothing related to 2020 just because that was a cursed year, but also because obviously the Lions are going to win their first Super Bowl ever this season. So
free money, take it to the bank.
I reject that, Christian. How about this? The Washington Post, for the first time in a long time, has decided not to endorse anyone for the presidency. And I think that wouldn't matter, considering anyone that reads the Post knows how all the columnists feel about Donald Trump. They've been running every pro-Harris op-ed that they could. And yet, 10% of its subscriber base has quit, which shows, are they buying journalism or are they just buying virtue signaling?
Well, I understand what Jeff Bezos is doing. He's trying to position himself in a good place no matter who wins the election. But when it comes down to it, he's running a business. And when you do anything that makes 10% of your client base just up and vanish, that's a huge mistake. I do think a storied institution like the Washington Post needs to take a stance. They should have done this, and they would have been able to, pad their piggy bank a little bit. Up next, we've got Donald Trump trying to retake the narrative from the garbage incident that happened at his rally the other day. Here he is trying to get into a dump truck. What do you make of this, Tiana?
I think it's clear he's actually having fun this time around, which, for all the joy and vibes that Harris says she has, I think Trump has all the joy and all the vibes, because that is an uninhibited man. He is unburdened by what has been. And that means, I think he thinks he's going to win. I don't know if he's going to win, but he definitely thinks he will.
I just like all the internet content Trump gives us. I mean, again, policies aside, potential derangement aside, the guy is just an entertainer, and I might miss it a little bit,
I don't think win or lose, he doesn't just go away, and that's the biggest myth about the Harris campaign, that her winning will somehow end 10 years of this.
They put a big sign on the truck. Did you see it? I think they showed it.
That's all the time we've got this week on Deadline. I'm Christian Datoc.
And I'm Tiana Lowe Doescher.
For more of our reporting, go visit washingtonexaminer.com, and we'll see you next week.